Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Charles Upton, Upton, and he's just published a book in October 2021 titled The Alien Disclosure Deception, The Metaphysics of Social Engineering. Fascinating book, great book. Really loved reading the book. This is not his first book. He's also published a book that I've seen quoted in some of the books that I've been reading. This book is The System of Antichrist, Truth and Falsehood in Postmodernism and the New Age, published 2001. Also, Vectors of the Counter-Tradition, The Course and Destiny of Inverted Spirituality, 2012.
Yeah, that's actually counter-initiation, but close enough.
Sorry, I must have mistyped that.
Okay.
Dugan Against Dugan, A Traditionalist Analysis of the Fourth Political Theory, that's 2018. And some of the material in Charles's book actually very kind of plays into some of these earlier interviews I've done this year in 2021 on two books having to do with subject matter that's included in Charles's book. One is, the title of the book is The Believer, Alien Encounters Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack by Ralph Blumenthal, and Adam Gorightly's Saucers, Spooks, and Kooks, U.S. Disinformation in the Age of Aquarius. These are both early 2021 books. But getting back to the Alien Disclosure Deception, really fascinating book. Loved reading it. I learned a lot in this book, and there's a lot of really good questions and insights. So I highly recommend people check this out. But Charles can talk more about that. So Charles Upton, welcome to the show.
Well, glad to be here. So
awesome. Well, thanks for agreeing to the interview. For people who may not have heard your background, may not be familiar with your earlier work, can you talk about this book and how some of your earlier research added into the alien disclosure deception?
Well, being of an age when I could be, of the hippie counterculture, one of the beliefs that was floating around along with every belief conceivable at that time was, the idea of the benevolent space brothers. So that was in the mix. So, and basically that period of my life got me interested in spiritual seeking, which really never stopped, and which led me ultimately in 1988 to join with the Sufis, who are the Islamic mystics. And it's been a very central influence in my life. And that and my background in the peace movement, worked with in the 60s, I was sort of a hanger-on with the anti-Vietnam protests. If somebody says, "Hey, man, there's a demonstration," I said, "Hey, man, I'll be there." Sometimes I drove people around. I wasn't really deeply involved, but that was part of the scene. Then in the 80s, my wife and I were involved with a Presbyterian church, of which we were elders of a Presbyterian church in Marin County, California, which was doing the sanctuary movement for Central American refugees. The idea was, if the U.S. is training death squads to kill people in El Salvador at the War College here and elsewhere, and if this is driving people out of Central America, then we as Americans have a duty to take them in. This was the theory at that point. Immigration is different now, not entirely different, but it has other elements. So I don't entirely go along with that view of things at this point, but I still think it was right for the time. So having a background in spiritual seeking and activism in, UFOs as part of the mix of beliefs that I was swimming in, it's natural that I should come up with this book. One of the things that came out of all this also was my work with the Covenants Initiative, which is basically based on the research of Dr. John Andrew Morrow, who during the age of ISIS brought forward these nearly forgotten treaties that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, made with Christians and other religious groups of his time. And they uniformly command all Muslims until the end of time to not to attack or rob or damage the buildings of peaceful Christians, but to defend them with force of arms if necessary. If a Christian church falls into disrepair, it's a pious act on the part of Muslims to help them rebuild it. Muslims are not to prevent their Christian wives from going to church. Now, all of this is, under the, this is the direct authorship by Muhammad himself, and he said these documents were inspired by Allah. So that these should come forward at the very time when ISIS was doing its worst damage was truly providential. I was very privileged to be part of this, and this is still going on. The Covenants Initiative, and it started in 2013, is still going on. So at that point, I realized that the Prophet Muhammad, he wanted to make a federation of all the peoples of the book, of the revealed religions of his time, and to defend, for mutual defense against the empires around them, which were the Persian and the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire didn't always get along with the Christians on its borders, which may have had different perspectives. So I saw, if I'm going to follow the Prophet, my responsibility is to defend the revealed religions. And then I come up against the UFO religion, which is being perpetrated at this point. And I'm seeing that some of the major leaders in the so-called disclosure movement hate religion. They damn it, they curse it, and they say that the UFO worship, as it were, is going to replace it. So obviously, I came into conflict with them at that point.
Right. So you kind of see this. The religion has its own eschatology and view that supplants the traditional Abrahamic type of religions. I mean, can you kind of, maybe for people who may not know disclosure or the UFO kind of arc of the UFO world to the present, can you kind of explain what they think is happening and what's going to happen and supposedly happened in 2021, right? Disclosure?
Well, disclosure has been going on. Disclosure, I mean, since probably the end of World War II, there have been ambiguous statements coming out of the U.S. government about what UFOs are, and people came, said to themselves, some people said, this doesn't entirely add up. The government isn't telling us everything that it knows, which I certainly agree with. And so out of that developed a movement to pressure the government to reveal what it knows about UFOs. And, now this movement over time became filled with a lot of people with government connections, a lot of, military brass, a lot of CIA agents or supposedly ex-CIA agents, that fill the disclosure movement. And so one wonders whether this isn't basically an infiltration of people who want to co-opt the movement and turn it to their own use. This is what I personally believe. And so what I'm asking for is not just disclosure of what the government knows about the phenomenon, because it must have infinite number of records besides what have been released of these various encounters, which are certainly very real and inexplicable. But I'd also like disclosure of exactly what these spooks and military brass are doing in the UFO movement, all coming forward and saying, we're whistleblowers. Who, we know the government's been lying to you because we're part of the government, and so we know, but now we're on your side, and we're going to pressure our bosses or former bosses to come clean with what they know. And they do this with impunity. But as many people who have been whistleblowers on sensitive subjects know, whistleblowers take their life in their hands sometimes. Their lives become, extremely difficult. These people have just been cruising along saying, yes, we're whistleblowers. We're, and finally, I don't buy it. Doesn't make sense.
Right. I don't buy it either. And you mentioned some of these people around to the Stars Academy later in the book, in a Netflix special. Some of these characters, Elizondo, supposedly, a whistleblower, but he seems to be fine. Seems to be doing all right. And there's a ton of intel in that too, the Stars Academy too.
Yeah.
So your position, I mean, you mentioned your position in the book. You truly believe that these UFO experiences are happening, right?
Certainly they are. And what I would like to do, personally, I believe that they are, which people are calling nowadays interdimensional, or, they're paranormal, They fit the profile of what the beings that the Muslims call the jinn, which is a very, it's a very wide angle term. There's lots of different realities under the word. The jinn, they're similar to the Northern European fairies. They have some similarities to the Christian idea of fallen angels or demons, at least the bad ones. And they don't act like alien astronauts. Like I say somewhere, Neil Armstrong and Yuri Gagarin do not, appear and disappear out of thin air and walk through your walls of your bedroom at night and hand you objects, which seem to be entirely material, but later dematerialize. And this is not astronaut behavior. Right. This is spook behavior. I mean, in the paranormal, not in the intelligence community sense of the word. And anyway, but what I want to say is, I think the question of what UFOs are, and whether they're astronauts who come here through space in material spaceships, or whether they're something else, which is what I believe. We need to set this aside a little bit and look at one thing. One thing in this whole realm is not being looked at, which is the statements made by the people who claim to speak for disclosure and want the government to disclose what it knows. In the Netflix original series, Top Secret UFO Projects Declassified, and in an interview that I recently saw with Stephen Greer, who says he founded the disclosure movement 20 years ago, we have statements that, taken just in isolation, could not be true. They are absurd. They are contradictory. They are so far beyond the realm of possibility that I ask myself, why did we accept them? Why are we so gullible to accept these statements? Well, I think it is because somehow ideas have been falsely linked. We say, well, if I'm skeptical about what these people are saying, does that not mean that I'm skeptical about the reality of UFOs, or I'm somehow denying the reality of UFOs? That's not what I want to do. I want to say UFOs are real. But does that mean that everything that people with government connections who have come into your movement say about them is real? No, there's no necessary relationship between those two things whatsoever. So believe in them. You bet they're real. They keep coming and coming, and they're inexplicable. And, they have changed human societies since World War II, but by their very prevalence and by, all the human responses to them. Things aren't the way they were before, right. Because UFOs and aliens, or whatever they are, loom very large in everyone's consciousness now. Now, I believe that there are people who, we would call social engineers, who said, well, they looked at, for example, Orson Welles' hoax about an alien Martian, a Martian invasion. It was a radio hoax. And they saw the effect of that, and they said, wow, that really worked, didn't it? Now, how can we use something like that to change collective mass consciousness?
Right. And that really, for people who don't know, that War of the Worlds broadcast scared the living daylights out of Americans. People thought it was real. People were running in the streets. They thought it was really authentic. So somebody on the intel said, oh, wow. Right. So somebody said,
if Orson Welles wasn't actually doing an experiment for them, which I would not assert because I have no evidence of that, but it makes you wonder, But anyway, so this idea has a lot of power. And, if the phenomenon keeps coming, I think that the people who want to manage our consciousness, manage our ideas, manage our beliefs, they said, well, we can't understand this. We cannot explain what this is. Although I believe that some people within that world think they can explain it, but that's an entirely different level having to do with the paranormal. Anyway, generally speaking, we can't explain what this is. We don't know, and we can't control it. And so this is rather disturbing, except since it keeps coming, why don't we just link certain ideas to it that will then appear to be corroborated every time a UFO appears in the sky? Because certain ideas have been connected with the phenomenon. Every time the phenomenon appears, well, that's more confirmation of our ideas that we want to impose upon the American people. And I think that's been done.
Right. So they're using this phenomenon to add on whatever they want to these events, these paranormal events.
Yeah. And, the people who have made these impossible statements, for example, Colonel Phillip Corso, who is no longer with us, well, he was on the Netflix documentary, and he tells his story. Well, I was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, maybe it was another one, I forget. It was one of the Air Force Base. And I was working there. I was the duty officer, and this a secret shipment came in. It was in the warehouse. So I was poking around trying to figure out, wonder what's in this secret shipment. Really interesting. So I just poking around at random, and I opened this wooden packing crate at random. And what do I see in there? Is an alien corpse with no attempt to preserve it. It's not in a hermetically sealed coffin, with temperature control. Just sitting in a wooden packing crate with no guards.
Wow.
So how likely is this? Is anybody who's ever been involved in military or intelligence willing to come forward and say, oh, yes, this is standard procedure in cases like this? I don't think so.
I don't either. And so these are Legion stories where these stories come out. There's even some guys out today, and you mentioned some of their names in the book. They're George Knapp, who's on Joe Rogan, this very influential podcast. So these ideas are still getting bandied about today.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, bandied. I mean, they're getting shoved down our throats. I mean, how many History Channel documentaries per week are coming out with this? Bam, bam. If you tell the same story over and over and over and over again, like we have in possession of alien corpses, we have in possession crashed alien vehicles, we're doing back in engineering, we have developed anti-gravity technology. Is any of this proved?
No.
It's all just asserted. But if you say it enough, people will say, "Oh, I guess that's the truth." Then,
yeah. And you actually dispute even whether the Roswell crash really happened with the so-called aliens, right?
I follow Jacques Vallée in that, who says he has his reasons, and I forget exactly what they are or whether he actually detailed them. But he says, I have my reasons for thinking that this was not actually an alien crash, and but we don't have proof of any of this stuff.
Right.
We have a myth. We have a constructed myth. The myth might be true in parts, but we don't know because it is presented as a myth, not as actual factual data that some scientist who's not doesn't want to get famous on the UFO circuit or is not involved with the military and the intelligence community will believe.
Yeah, and you talk in your book, you talk about the virtual eraser in our time of the line between science and science fiction.
Yes.
So we
know what happened a millisecond, a nanosecond after the Big Bang, right? We know what happened, except we're not sure the Big Bang ever really happened.
Right. Well, that's
goes wild. It's what's ideal is to find some area of physical reality that is hopefully impossible to ever really corroborate any speculations about. So you speculate in this vacuum, and if you've got the chutzpah and the ability to silence your critics and your colleagues, then you're home free, and you are saying what reality is, and nobody can disprove you because your assertions can neither be checked by scientific experiment nor by data from astronomy. They're beyond both of those limits, and so you can say any damn thing you want. And there are people who are making careers doing this.
A lot of money too. Stephen Greer is one of them. And you want to talk about the occult? He has that lightning hitting the tree at the beginning of his shows, which is heavy duty Luciferianism, which is another whole story. But I think it ties actually into this whole story because you say that a lot of these experiencers and a lot of these people have some type of experience in the occult or have dabbled or done ritual magic. I mean, you mentioned.
Well, that's what I forget his first name, Corbin, years ago.
Yeah, Michael Corbin.
And he said that was what he had discovered.
That's right.
And but one of the stories about this now, I'm sure you've heard of the illustrious Jack Parsons.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, okay. He had no direct relationship, as far as I know, to UFO phenomena. I may be wrong, but certainly he's in the ballpark because he's the point where you see the magical worldview and the scientific worldview coming together. And he was a rocket scientist who was a co-founder of the Aerojet Corporation and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He submitted early designs for the Pentagon building. He has a crater named after him on the dark side of the moon.
He used to call Werner von Braun for information. He used to call him up and ask him rocketry stuff. So he was very well connected and all that stuff.
Very well connected. But he did pagan rituals at his launchings. He said, "My purpose in life is to destroy Christianity." Right. And he was a follower of Black magician Aleister Crowley. He and L. Ron Hubbard were, both students of Crowley who were together in the Thelema Lodge. It was the Agape Lodge in L.A. And so he was a magician.
Yeah, Crowley called him his most important student. So he wasn't just an OTO member. He was considered by Crowley to be the most important.
Yeah, and what's interesting is our image of the gray alien apparently comes from an entity called Lum that Aleister Crowley brought through in one of his magical operations called the Amalantra workings in 1918 in order to open a portal to another dimension. And he drew a picture of this being, and there you have your gray, your first
right in New York City. Yeah, so the original gray.
Yeah. And
just to add something that I didn't notice in your book, but Jack Parsons actually made the oath of the Antichrist, and you can get that. So he literally put himself into the position of the Antichrist. Yeah. And so it's a very important statement of his that he thought that sometimes is overlooked, but I think it ties into your theme of the Antichrist.
Yeah, certainly. And what's interesting is there's a YouTube video now. If you can find it, it's a film of Jack Parsons doing his own little magical thing called the Babylon workings. That's Babylon, which is his name for a female entity that he was channeling. And he says, "Okay, you see this box here? This is like an electronic Ouija board. It has a magnetic field, and since those entities on that side can interact with magnetic fields, she can talk to me and give me simple yes/no answers, and like a Ouija board." So and he says to the filmmaker, "This is how we invoke demons." So very upfront about this. And I think that's still going on, actually.
That's right. I mean,
on a large scale. Okay.
Right. Well, some people have even speculated that Babylon working was what kind of opened up a veil and brought these so-called UFO entities into the greater thing. They really were intention of making magical change.
It's helpful. It's one. I mean, they can come through without magicians, but magicians, grease the slide and make it easier for them to get through.
Right. So there's Crowley to Parsons to Hubbard goes the whole mad kind of sorcerers, magical tradition, also occultism and anti-traditional, Abrahamic religions too out the door. So those are all kind of
well, and that's Stephen Greer in a recent interview with Sarah Westall, who also interviewed me not long ago, was just saying, boy, he had no attempt to conceal his hatred for religion. He hates. Religion. Every time you see religion, there's religious nuts, religious lunatics, superstitious religious lunatics. On and on. And one of the things he really hates is the doctrine of good and evil. I mean, that's, I didn't
know that.
Excuse me. As far as I'm concerned, it's like the son of Sam, for example, of those murders. I consider that an example of evil. And I have a friend, Eric Galati, who is reopening the investigation of the Son of Sam stuff. And a lot of more material is coming to him because, essentially he's showing larger connections in various satanic networks of Berkowitz. And people are coming through with dossiers. So this is a very interesting what he's doing. I would consider that good. But according to Stephen Greer, you better not make a distinction like that, because if you develop an us versus them, good versus evil attitude, this will put the Space Brothers off, and they might not, invite the Earth to join the Galactic Federation if we're too much involved in this good and evil thing.
Wow.
See, so what you got to be is a nihilist. If you're a nihilist, maybe they'll let you in. Which, I don't know if you ever read Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land.
Yes, I did, actually, very recently.
Book, because I forget the name of the alien in there, but he a total nihilist.
It's Valentine Smith.
Valentine Smith, okay. Mr. Smith was a total nihilist, and it was made to seem so progressive and so, well, he's like, they're beyond good and evil out there in space. Wow, maybe we could do that, and
that was Charles Manson's favorite book, and he named one of his kids Valentine too.
I didn't know.
True story. Yeah, that's a true story.
There you go.
There's a lot of philosophizing in Heinlein, and Heinlein was in that same kind of community too. It's science fiction, Hubbard, and those characters.
Oh yeah, Hubbard. What was Hubbard's great book, Typewriter in the Sky? I never read it, but the title always intrigued me.
Battlefield Earth, I think, was another one of his magnum opus. But yeah, so do you always find it? So Greer is a perfect example of the character of the Space Brothers. They have a definite character, right?
Well, these beings are attempting to destroy the belief in God in the human race and put themselves in God's place. Part of the doctrine of the emerging UFO religion is that we were not created by God. We were created by the UFO aliens through genetic engineering. They have been our guides all along, and now we need to turn to them instead of God, which is old age thinking, and that's the old paradigm, which will prevent the human race from coming into its full adulthood and join the Galactic Federation. All we have to do is forget good and evil and become total nihilists, and then we can do that. But religion will get in the way, and that's why they hate religion, because they want to be worshipped instead of God.
Yeah, it's incredible. And it's also all of those occult groups and cult groups, so many of them have this space opera that's consistent with UFO mythology. It's really remarkable.
Yeah.
You mentioned Marshall Applewhite. Yeah.
That was a weird one.
Yeah, that was a weird one. And you kind of actually said, I think you said that you made kind of a bold claim. You have the most comprehensive and definitive explanation of the UFO phenomenon today.
Well,
can you expand on that?
Come forward and show me a better one, and then I will bow to that person's view. But I'm going to say that and see what happens, because Jacques Vallée was close, because Jacques Vallée was able to talk about these are physical. This is a physical phenomenon. This is also a psychic phenomenon. It's got paranormal elements, and there seem to be human deception activities around it. And he just brought these forward, and I simply said, I accepted all of that, but I drew the lines. I connected the dots, and I described why deception was part of the mix in the UFO mythology, or in the UFO human response to the UFO phenomenon. And I think I did that a little more completely than anybody else I've read. So.
And I'd say that you are kind of right in there with the maybe evangelical Christians that aliens are demons.
And I wanted to come at it from many different standpoints to establish that, instead of just saying the Bible says they're demons, which I agree. I agree with the evangelical Christians, but they don't, generally speaking, look at the phenomenon from many different standpoints and establish that, although better than the evangelical Christians is Seraphim Rose, who was an Eastern Orthodox, American Eastern Orthodox priest who lived in California. He was actually the secretary for Alan Watts in his pre-Orthodox incarnation. And then he became an Orthodox priest. My wife and I actually went to visit his grave up in the monastery of St. Herman of Alaska Brotherhood in Platina, California, up in the foothills, California foothills. Coast Range, and he has a book called Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, which I have some problems with, but his chapter on UFOs is great because he like myself turns both to René Guénon and to Jacques Vallée and comes up with a theory and a picture of what the UFO phenomenon is. And his point is, read the lives of the Orthodox saints from late antiquity, and you will see exactly the same thing that you're seeing from the UFO phenomenon today. But in the person of the various demonic entities who were being worked with by the pagan magicians of those times, when paganism was still strong, magic was still very common. There are plenty of stories of Orthodox saints encountering exactly the same phenomena as we are today.
So and the Apocrypha includes Peter battling with Simon Magus, right? A magician at that time.
Yeah,
So those are kind of the larger things. You kind of see these same workers of occultism, magicianry or sorcery, and the phenomenon.
Yeah, this is the tradition that René Guénon called the counter tradition, or the center of the counter tradition being the counter initiation. Initiatory groups whose purpose is to subvert and destroy the religions revealed by God. Generally, the Abrahamic religions, but certainly these beings have no love for any religion that accepts the reality of God, and they are the dark side of the spiritual life and the spiritual understanding. So,
and it's very similar. I actually saw similarities between John Dee's sorcery and talking to the beings, and they're almost like aliens. They do the same thing. They encourage sexual depravity or wife swapping and weird stuff that you would see. That so the counter initiation is getting humanity to believe these are aliens, not entities from some other dimension that have
doing that. But the time may come where it will flip around and saying, I can foresee a time where someone will start to say, well, of course these beings are actually the beings that a backward and superstitious Christianity slandered under the name of demons. We know that if you call them demons, if you will, but they're really better than that. Don't. In other words, there is getting to be a transvaluation of all values, where evil is called good and good is called evil, and Lucifer ultimately will want to come out and say, hey man, that's who I am, I'm Lucifer, worship me. He can't do that yet, but he's getting closer. And one of the steps is to say, well, we believe these beings because we think they're from other planets. But slowly, and you can see in the Netflix documentary, the idea that they are, quote, spiritual, interdimensional, or paranormal, or as the Catholics would say, preternatural beings, is already there right under the surface. So,
right, and the name of that documentary that you analyze in all the sections is Top Secret UFO Projects Declassified.
Right.
So you kind of go through and just show. You actually ask, is it really a scientific documentary or is it a religious tract? I opt for the latter, definitely.
Yeah, I think so.
And you actually bring up some names of people. I've had communications with Peter Lavender, who's also involved in the To the Stars.
Peter Lavender, he's been so helpful. I could never have seen the outlines of the social engineering agenda since World War II, using UFOs to change human consciousness and belief systems. Without Lavender, he has all the evidence. And then he does not accept that interpretation of his own work, because he's now, possibly because he's now with To the Stars Academy, which is one of the major entities in the disclosure movement, whose founder, rock star Tom DeLonge, was in communication with the Hillary Clinton campaign and John Podesta. We learned this through the emails that Edward Snowden lifted from the NSA website, which are now available through WikiLeaks. You can check it out. And they were talking about UFOs with the Hillary Clinton people. And he was saying, yeah, it's really coming along. It's great. And my book, Secret Machines, is coming out, in which Lavender actually provided an afterword to. So he appears in the WikiLeaks.
He might have written the whole thing. He might have ghostwritten the whole book. That's my understanding.
Well, yeah, he's reputed to have written things that he does not take credit for, like the Necronomicon, as one of a grimoire that was as a fictional beginning in works by H.P. Lovecraft. But anyway, and one of the things DeLong says, and one of the people we should have at our meetings really is Steven Spielberg. I'll invite him.
Right.
Well, one of the things that started me off on this sense of we're being, mind controlled was Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And I looked at that movie and I came out and I said, this is a mind control job. And, I was there with my hippie colleagues and I said, hey guys, this has got to be a CIA trip or something here. And they said, oh, no, you don't understand. This is real and this is what's going to happen, and they bought it. I was pretty alone for a long time, but then slowly, evidence that I was right has emerged over the decades. So,
gotcha. Well, this is an interesting thing on Lavender. If you have some time, Charles, you can go to Secrets of Secret Societies on YouTube, and you can watch Peter Lavender in an OTO ritual. So,
does he have a particular a magical tradition? Because I never knew.
Well, it's a good question. I think that he came up through New York at the Magical Child, which is an occult bookstore there, and he had a lot of connections. But I mean, he's in an OTO ritual right here. I think he knows a lot about Crowley, but I don't know his specific one.
Yeah, and he could be eclectic, and I was wondering if he was Crowley, if he was Thelema, or if he was or a New Order of the Golden Dawn or something like that. But if nothing would prevent him from learning from everybody.
Right. Well, I mean, if you kind of get back to Crowley was kind of a polyglot too, or meant to be.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, he's kind of an aggregator.
Yeah, and in terms of magic, my mentor as a poet, which is what I used to be, a San Francisco poet, was a Beat Generation poet, Lou Welch. And some people may know that name. And he introduced me to two people who really were the keynotes for my whole life after that. One was Sufi Samuel Lewis, who was, sort of missionary of the Sufis to the hippies in the 60s. And the other was Carlos Castaneda.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, there was Lou Welch used to have what he called the full moon mussel feast at Muir Beach, California in August, where your ticket to get in was you pick 6 mussels off the rocks, big mussels like this, you can just pick, and throw them into the big pot he had and he would pour in, white wine Chablis and onions, and that would become mussel stew. And so that's what would let you in. And I went to one of these, and he was there, and he was thinking peyote, and the Grateful Dead was there, and all the hippies were freaking. And he says, Charles, come over here. There's somebody I'd like you to meet. And I said, oh, okay. And there was this little guy, this very neatly dressed in a suit and tie, short, diminutive Latino guy. And I said, you would look entirely out of place, And he said, this is a Mr. Carlos Castaneda. I read his book, The Teachings of Don Juan, and it's my Bible at this point. And I'd like you to meet him. He says, oh, well, hi, man. Shook his hand and ran off because I had never heard of him at that point. I had not read the book yet. It was just the first book just came out. So that was Castaneda.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, you have some curious. You've been around. I mean, you converse with Malachi Martin, William Burroughs. Definitely have. I mean, you mentioned their names in the book. Yeah. Somebody asked, is there any more recent movie you think we should watch besides those you mentioned in your earlier book on UFOs?
Yeah. Mirage Men. Mirage Men, I forget who produced it, but it was on YouTube free for a while. Now you have to pay. But it's a great picture of the kind of guys that I'm talking about. Richard Dolan and Stephen Greer and the smoke and mirrors people who are prominent in the UFO community now. It's amazing. It just shows how they operate. You're familiar with the term of a magician's patter? Patter, patter.
It sounds familiar. What is that?
It's like the stage magician is here and he's saying, and now my lovely assistant will take the sword and decapitate blah, blah, blah. And he's talking away. And his method of talking is designed to destroy your vigilance and to misdirect your attention. It's very well thought out, and it's an art in itself. It's patter. And these people use pattern. They talk in a long series of contradictions, glibly passing from thing to thing, which, and giving you no time to think and say, wait a minute, did you say? No, they just, and if you want to see how they operate, look at Mirage Men. It's a great movie. And it'll give you a feeling for the kind of smoke and mirrors, the kind of deception that is being laid down now. Because, look, if it is really true, and I think it is, that we are being deceived by these people on as important a subject as UFOs, and this has been going on for decades, I consider this to be intolerable. I consider this to be something that's got to be stopped. And I would say we need to learn to analyze statements. Don't take it out of the context. Take it out of all the images and other ideas. He said, what? Just look at it, figure out if it means anything at all. You'll find there's an awful lot of stuff that could not be true. And once you find something you think that isn't true, you need to get back to the person who made that statement personally and say, could you please clarify this? And if this person does not clarify it to your satisfaction, you need to publish that fact. I talked to so-and-so about how this could possibly be true, which seems to make no sense to me. And I got the runaround. He didn't answer. So I'm reporting that this person is not responsive, because we need to deconstruct what these people are doing, because it's extremely destructive.
Right, it's really true. They're really deceiving a lot of young minds,
yes,
naive people, wanting people. I did another thing about a kind of a UFO kind of cult, and people commit suicide. There's all kinds of negative, deleterious consequences of being involved in this UFO. You kind of actually liken it to kind of being subjected to demonology, but you actually state that if I can quote your book, the UFO phenomenon represents the most concentrated yet widespread manifestation of this counter-initiation yet to appear, and the one most successful on a mass level. I agree with you. I think that's really true. This counter-initiation really has taken place. Yeah. I think we're past the initiation phase. Yeah.
Yeah, and since I wrote that, somebody sent me a file translated from the French by a French follower of René Guénon, who was saying 40 years ago, if some kind of actual religion is going to emerge from all this occult New Age stuff, the best candidate for it will be the UFO religion. 40 years ago. And was he right.
Yeah, and here's the picture of Podesta, Lavender, and DeLong right here. People are watching this. Yeah. I think that's at the White House. It looks like it's at the White House, but I don't know.
Or it's not really sure. Like it's the White
House. Or something. It looks like a government building. Government building. Yeah, and you cover René Guénon, like you mentioned these books, Valets, Messengers of Deception, and Guénon, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. Can you tell the people who René Guénon was and why he was important in this?
René Guénon was a French metaphysician with a background as a mathematician. He wrote on the infinitesimal calculus, and early in the 20th century, I think mostly between the world wars, he investigated. He was a Catholic, but he felt that Catholicism had lost some of its, inner dimension, or it wasn't at least understood in a deep enough way. So he was looking for other things, and he investigated every kind of occult or esoteric group that was active in France at that time. The Gnostics, the the Maronists, the Theosophists, absolutely every group. And after a time, he came out and he said, "Look, this stuff is not just, harmlessly foolish. This is dangerous stuff. This is subversive." His first two books were Theosophy, the History of a Pseudo-Religion, and was it The Spiritist Imposture? I think it was called. It was a expose of spiritualism, and these are really good. I mean, they've got a certain amount of social criticism and some of the quality of the conspiracy theory that we so recognize today. But he was looking at the danger of these groups. At the same time, he was studying the actual esoteric teachings of the true religions, Islam, Chinese religion, from the tradition of, I guess, Taoism and the I Ching, and particularly Hinduism. He wrote a classic on Hindu doctrine called "A Man and His Becoming According to the Vedanta." So he was finding the true esoteric teachings, not the fake or the inverted or the satanic esoteric teachings, but the inner teachings of the living world religions. And he made a distinction there, which is a very important distinction to make. And so he was a Catholic, and he dialogued with Jacques Maritain, a famous neo-Thomist philosopher in France, and trying to see if Catholicism could be returned to its inner esoteric dimension, which he felt was impossible. One of his major error, I'm going to say, is that he saw in Freemasonry a chance for Catholicism to regain its esoteric center, which I don't agree with at all. But and of course, he knew that Freemasonry had a lot of problems. He was very involved in trying to reform Freemasonry. He wrote articles for pro Freemasonic journals and anti-Freemasonic journals. It's because Freemasonry gives the picture of something like a Sufi order within Christianity, and that became sort of his model of what an inner esoteric Christianity would be. Whereas one of his followers, Fritjof Schuon, corrected Guénon on that point, and he said, no, actually, traditional Christianity, Orthodoxy, and Catholicism is in essence esoteric, but the esoteric is not separated from the exoteric. It's just the inner meaning of the exoteric. In Islam, you have the jurists who are studying the Sharia, and then you have the Sufis who are a separate stream. They're not a different religion, but they're a separate stream of an initiatory stream that deals with the inner mystical dimension. And there's a sort of polarity, sometimes friendly, sometimes not, between those two poles. Whereas in Christianity, they're all one. And Schuon was very right in saying, Christianity is an initiatory religion, and the initiation rites are baptism, confirmation, which the Orthodox call chrismation, and the Eucharist. And this is entirely in line, actually, with what Dionysius the Areopagite said in his book, The Ecclesiastical Hierarchy. Christianity is, traditional Christianity, not Protestant Christianity, is an initiatory religion. So I agree with Schuon there, not with Guénon. But in any case, Guénon found he could not reform Catholicism or Freemasonry to his liking. So he gave up. He moved to Egypt, and he embraced Islam and became an initiated Sufi, and spent the rest of his life, as a practicing Muslim in Cairo. So
fascinating.
Yeah.
Still influential to this day. I mean, he's mentioned in a lot of different places.
I mean, the Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times is a prophetic book for our time, and every year it becomes more relevant.
Fascinating. And we're almost at about an hour here, Charles. Is there anything you'd like to add, or anything I missed before we wrap up the interview?
Well, I don't think so.
But I mean, I think there's a lot more in this book. You talk about Mac. You analyze the Netflix show. There's a lot of references in this. You talk kind of about materialism, and then really your position, which people can read about, that this UFO phenomenon is laying the groundwork for the return of the Antichrist, right?
Yeah, it is. And one of the other little elements in that book, there's some analysis of post-war cinema as basically UFO propaganda, because a lot of the science fiction movies pre-Spielberg in those days, like the Day the Earth Stood Still, and particularly Red Planet Mars. I mean, these things were produced by people who had been producing propaganda films for the Signal Corps during World War II, and now they come out, and then suddenly they're still producing propaganda films, but it's for the UFO myth. Oh, the one thing I want to end with is one of the great things Lavender brings forward is that Douglas MacArthur in 1962, speaking to cadets at West Point, told them that they would have to prepare for a future war between a united Earth and the sinister forces of some other planetary galaxy. This is Douglas MacArthur, and you can check it out. I checked it out. It wasn't, Lavender didn't make it up. There it is. So this idea of the UFOs, you know, and a global government, united Earth, right? They're entirely related. Either we have to have world government to fight off the alien invaders, or we have to have world government because that will you know, put us in line to be initiated by the good aliens into the Galactic Federation. One way or another, the goal is global government. So.
Right. There's so much. And you mentioned Whitley Strieber in here. I'll tell you some stuff offline, but yeah, great book. Really loved reading. Really fascinating analysis of this whole disclosure deception. Again, the title. And where's the best place for people to get the book, Charles?
Well, it's on Amazon. I mean, someday I'll put I don't have a button for it on my website yet. Just go to Amazon, look at Charles Upton, the title, you'll get it. There it is.
And what's your website, Mr. Upton?
It's charles-upton.com.
Okay.
Yeah, that's got a bunch of my books and
Charles-Upton.
various articles.
I'll put that in the show notes to charlesupton.com with a link to the book. Highly recommend this book. Again, the title is The Alien Disclosure Deception, The Metaphysics of Social Engineering, published October 2021 by Charles Upton. Thank you so much, Charles.
Well, thank you. Great to do it.
Great to talk with you. All right, stay there. Don't go anywhere. Okay. Okay, that